Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a four-game Major League Baseball slate that starts at 1 o'clock. The first game starts at 1, two of those games are at 2 o'clock, and then one's at 4 o'clock. I really wish that due to all the cancellations today that they had extended the slate and included the two later games, because those games are actually somewhat better on the slate. But overall, there's not going to be too many weather issues aside from maybe some wind. Every game should be good to go here, and so that is a good sign. We do have some high-scoring games, especially in this potentially with the Colorado-Washington game that's at 4. Obviously, when Colorado plays at Colorado, those games tend to have good metrics because due to elevation and stuff. That is going to be a colder game, but all four games on this particular slate are in the 40s or 50s, so it's the weather really not going to be a big issue or a big difference there when it comes to that. The two later games tonight that don't include on the slate are higher, much warmer. But with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. I do have some core plays for you. I have them here on DraftKings. McMahon, Menendez, and Thomas for Washington, and over here on FanDuel we have Menendez, McMahon, and Thomas as well. I think those three guys are just the best plays on the slate. But let's go ahead and get into the pitchers here on DraftKings, and we'll get over to FanDuel. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Also, check out the Discord link in the below, and also check out the Patreon thing. Patreon, you can pretty much just enter whatever point you want, and you get access to the write-ups that I do for DraftKings for baseball. Basically, the stuff that I talk about in the video is just written down, kind of, and I give you my thoughts on each player that I've listed. With that said, let's get into it. For the pitchers here, we're going to start with Chris Sale. Now, he has some high risk, high reward situation today. He is cheap enough that he's definitely usable here. But he's pitched 3 games in 2 seasons. He has 2 negative scores. He has a high risk, high reward here, obviously. He had 1 good game in those 3 games, and his opponent does help here, but it does feel like it's a risky game. He does have good strikeout stuff, which is nice, but he is a bit risky on the slate. He didn't do particularly good in his first game against Baltimore, who's actually a pretty good hitting team, and so I do think he's high risk, high reward, but he's cheap enough that he's definitely worth taking a look at. Kevin Gausman is probably my favorite option on the slate, but he is no longer here. Where'd he go? Oh, I'm done. Sorry about that, guys. Anyhow, Kevin Gausman is the best pitcher, I think, on the slate available. He is also the most expensive one. However, he is a little bit inconsistent, but he is the top of the strikeout rate today for Vegas strikeouts, and he should get the win here. This is a pretty good matchup for him, and he should be the de facto P1 choice for pitcher. I do think he's in a good spot here. As for Lance Lynn for Chicago White Sox, he's a good cheaper option if you need to utilize a cheaper option. He's a good way to go away from either Gausman or Sale, and he has some nice upside in this matchup here against San Francisco, who does tend to be decent, but good pitching tends to squash them. And he was okay in his first game against Houston, which is actually pretty hard to do. And so I do think he's a decent option on the slate. I don't think he's a must-play, but he's definitely one of the better overall pitchers on the slate in general, so that gives him some utility. And then kind of a contrarian / Hail Mary option is Alex Wood, who hasn't played yet this season, but he's a good contrarian play here. He's good if you want to take a riskier path than Lynn for P2, or if you want to go broke, go for broke in the GPP. So I think he is somebody that's worth taking a look at, but I do like some Chicago bats today, so I don't necessarily think that he's a great play on the slate. With that said, let's get into the catchers, and we basically have 2 or 3 catchers to look at here. First being Keibler Ruiz for Washington. Now, he's got to get a nice boost here, and he's hit the ball pretty well so far for Washington. It's not the best situation for him, but it's not bad since it's in Colorado, where he's going to have more opportunity to hit a home run here, and he started the season well enough that he's definitely worth a look here. Another good option is Alejandro Kirk for Toronto. He's also in a very interesting spot. He's got a good matchup here against Kansas City, and he's been really good so far. He's also pretty cheap for his for what he'll probably be as the season progresses. So I like him in this situation as well. If you want to get away from that Washington Colorado game, he's definitely a great way to do it. And then kind of a not a Hail Mary even, but just an alternative option to those guys is Yasmani Grandal. Now obviously he does have a tougher pitching matchup, but he has some upside here. He has hit a home run there already this season, and I look for him to continue to play pretty well. He's a pretty good catcher, excuse me, whenever he has good metrics, and he definitely has the good metrics in this situation. So let's go ahead and get at first base. We're going to start with Vladimir Guerrero Jr. He is the top play at first base, and he's also pretty expensive, but he's been extremely good so far against Kansas City and just generally on the season. He's had 3 really good games and another couple of games that are okay. He's gotten hits in most of the games as well, and he hit a home run yesterday. I look for him to have potential to hit another one today. He's got a great matchup here, and he looks like he's set up for another great opportunity. Then we're going to look at Michael Chavis for Washington. Now he's high risk, high reward. I've got him slated as a Hail Mary play. He's only played 2 games so far this season, but he did get hits in those games, and he's got a nice. He's a nice option if you want to go with the Washington stack and you need a value play at this position. He can also play second base, which gives him some added utility. And then just a good alternative option is Brandon Belt, who's also pretty inexpensive for Toronto. He hasn't hit the ball well so far yet this season, but he is a guy that when the situation showcases for a good one, he tends to be okay in those situations, and that's kind of where he sits today. It's a good situation for him, so I do think he's in a viable spot, assuming he draws a start, but he is a bit risky. At second base, we're going to look at Ryan McMahon. Now, he has some really good opportunity here for Colorado. He is much better at home than on the road, and most like most Colorado players, and he's one of the better options on this slate, especially at a position that there's really just not much else to consider, and his price is actually pretty fair as well, so I really do like him in this upside. Michael Chavis is another guy who you could obviously slate here, but I also mentioned Jonathan Schoop for Detroit. Now he's in a risky situation against Chris Sale, but he does have some upside here. He does have good metrics against Sale, so that gives him some opportunity here. But he's extremely high risk, extremely high risk on that particular situation. At third base, I do like third base quite a bit today. We have a couple of good options here. First, we're going to start with Jahmir Candelario for Washington. He has only a couple hits so far this season, but he has home run potential in this game. He's also had a couple decent games in 8, 9, and 16 fantasy points, and in the other games he didn't really do so much. But he does have some good upside in a matchup where he could hit a home run, and he's got good potential in this matchup. Now he is also cheap, which definitely gives him some upside at this situation. Obviously, Rafael Devers is a great hitter, but his situation is not ideal really for fantasy. He's way expensive, but he is affordable with the way the pitchers are today. So he is definitely somebody you can take a look at. But he is risky since the situation he's in is kind of tough and not ideal when it comes to weather and all that kind of stuff. Yoan Makeda, also another option at the for Chicago White Sox in a tough matchup, but he has some utility here. He is a contrarian play if you can afford it, but he's not at all ideal. But he has hit the ball extremely well to start the season, hitting .440, having 2 home runs. And so I look for him to have some utility as kind of a contrarian option on the slate. If you want to pay up but not pay up for Devers, he'd be a way to do that. At shortstop, we have Tim Anderson for Chicago, who is kind of in a weird spot, but he does tend to do pretty good fantasy-wise, and that's why I've got him listed here. This position is kind of tough to get value in today, and so you're probably going to want to pay up at shortstop at least a little bit, and he's one way you could do it. He has some really good upside, as he does tend to have pretty good games most of the time. Bo Bichette, also very interesting today for Toronto. Now, he has somewhat of a higher risk, higher reward than Tim Anderson does, because he has probably more home run potential today. He's a good contrarian play to Anderson if you want to pay up at this position. And then for a value play here, Javier Baez for Detroit. He's in a very high-risk, high-reward situation, but in certain situations he has good value, and this is one of those situations where I like to take a chance on a guy that could hit a home run, and he definitely has that potential, especially if you don't want to pay up that much for somebody here, so you can afford the guys you want elsewhere. And into the outfield, we are going to start with Joey Menendez. He has some really good upside in this slate. I really like him as a great option. He has home run potential in this game, and he's one of my core top plays for a home run. He's not priced as ideally as I had hoped him to be, but he does have some nice upside in this matchup. Same kind of goes for Lane Thomas, only he's priced extremely well. I really like his price here. He's hit the ball really solid so far to start the season. He hasn't got a home run yet, but he's somewhat due for that, and his price makes him very rosterable on the slate. I do expect him to be highly owned, but he definitely has good utility on this matchup. Luis Robert for Chicago White Sox. He's had 3 straight games over 14 fantasy points. That makes him viable here. He hit 2 home runs in a row 2 games ago, so I think he's in a really good spot. He also has he has seen the ball pretty well. He's only had 1 game where he didn't have a hit so far, and I look for him to have a good quality game. His price makes him somewhat difficult to roster, and I will say that there's a lot of good value at this position, so he's not necessarily that important to roster. Dalton Varsho also looks extremely interesting here. He's had 4 games over 10 fantasy points this season. He's rolling right now. He has a plus matchup, and he's a cheap option at this position, and that definitely makes him viable on the slate. Then we're going to look at Profar for Colorado. He's kind of in a high-risk, high-reward value situation. He's cheap enough to take a look at, but he is a little bit risky, but is a plus matchup here in Colorado since the ball should be flying there, and I expect him to have a pretty solid game here. He is a little bit riskier than some of the other options I mentioned, but he's cheap enough that he's definitely worth taking a look. And then for a Hail Mary option at this position, Stone Garrett, if he draws a start, he has some extremely high-risk, high-reward opportunity here. But if he does draw the start, he definitely has some utility. He's also super cheap, which helps you pay up at other positions, and so he's definitely worth taking a look at. Let's go ahead and move over to FanDuel, and we're going to go ahead and get started in our pitchers here, and we really just have 3 pitchers to consider in Chris Sale, Kevin Gausman, and Lance Lynn. Chris Sale has high risk as he's only pitched 3 games in 2 years, but he does have some upside versus a weak opponent, and that does give him some utility here. But he had a really tough game in his first game this season. As for Kevin Gausman, he's probably I'd probably like him a little bit better, even though he's the most expensive option on the slate. He has the best strikeout potential on a subpar team, and he should have a good opportunity to be the top pitcher on the slate. But if anybody is going to potentially push him for that, it could be Lance Lynn against San Francisco. It's a little bit riskier than Gausman, I think, but he is safer than Sale, and but he doesn't have the K potential Gausman has, but he does have a decent matchup as well, so it does give him some utility here. It's a little bit higher risk than Sale, or lower risk than Sale, but higher risk than Gausman on the slate. I do think that it will be a kind of a split on how people use Gausman and Lynn on this situation, or maybe even all 3 of those guys. I think they could all be in the mid-30s in usage, so we'll have to wait and see, obviously, but it's going to be somewhat tough to pick your pitcher here on FanDuel from that perspective. For first base and catcher, here on FanDuel, obviously, they mix first base and catching, and in today's slate, it's really not worth worrying about the actual catchers on this one. Joey Menendez is the de facto best option. He's great on both sites. He's priced a lot better here on FanDuel than he is on DraftKings too, which makes him very useful here at $3,500. I do think he's got home run potential in this game, and he started the season pretty well. I'm also going to look at Vlad Jr., who has hit the ball pretty well so far this season at 360, and he hit a home run already yesterday, so I do think he has some upside in this matchup. He's a little bit harder to roster, being a little bit more expensive, but he does have some utility here. That's pretty much all that I think is you need at first base or catcher. You could also put both guys in your lineup and put Vlad Jr. down here in the utility spot, or Menendez in the utility spot. That's one of the nice things about FanDuel, is that they have that utility spot for any player, and I definitely think either one of those guys would be a good option in that slate. As for second base, Ryan McMahon is my favorite player at this position. He is a little bit riskier since he hasn't hit the ball particularly great this season, but again, once you get back in Colorado players Anderson to play a lot better. And that gives him some really good upside in this matchup. He could also play second or third base, which gives him some added utility. I definitely like him better at second base, just given the options at this position. Javier Baez is a good value play here, but he's high risk, high reward in this situation. He doesn't have the best matchup against Chris Sale, but he does have the potential sometimes to get home runs, and this is a situation where I think he has some utility. And then Michael Chavis. He has some low-end upside here. He's a high-risk, high-reward Hail Mary play on the slate. If he draws a start, he'd be somebody to take into consideration. He can play first, second, or third base, and he could even be in that utility spot as well. But he's very high risk, and somebody that I only want to utilize if he doesn't have, if you just desperate to save money somewhere. At third base, obviously, Ryan McMahon and Chavis can both play those positions, but we also have Jameer Candelario, who I really like today. I think he's got some good upside here. He's got home run potential in this game in Colorado, which gives some upside, though he does strike out more than some of the other options on the slate. At shortstop, we're going to look at, Jerkinson Profar first. He's very cheap here on FanDuel, which gives him some utility. He can also play in the outfield, and he can also be a utility spot, so that also opens up some opportunity for him. He does have some risk in this situation, but he should be better in Colorado as well, just like most players on their team. Now, Tim Anderson's a very good option on this slate as well at shortstop. Shortstop is probably the best position outside the outfield and first base on FanDuel. He's just got some good upside, and he's actually priced pretty fairly here. Bo Bichette is more expensive, but he does have some utility in this matchup. He's a little bit high risk, high reward. And then obviously Javier Baez, who I already mentioned, is a good value play at shortstop as well. As for the outfilders, we do start with Lane Thomas, who is just my favorite play on FanDuel at his price. He's hit the ball pretty well so far this season, and he's got really good upside in this matchup, and he will get a home run eventually, and this is a good spot for him to do so. Dalton Varsho, also very interesting here on FanDuel. He's got a home run so far already this season, but he's had 4 really good games. I expect that to continue here, and he's got a great matchup against Kansas City, and I look for him to continue to be solid. Now, I really like Luis Robert today at $3,600. He's about the same price as Menendez, and he's a good value. Good value for his potential here. He's hit the ball extremely well so far this season. He's had 3 straight 18 fantasy point or better games, and I do think he has the potential to continue that today in this matchup against San Francisco. I already mentioned Jerkinson Profar, and then also Stone Garrett, who could also be a cheap option in the outfield. He's a little bit high risk, high reward, but he does have some utility here at a very cheap price. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.